You'll never recover financially," Adrian said, standing in the doorway of what used to be our shared home office. Arms crossed, the particular smugness of a man who believed he was delivering a devastating final word rather than a sentence he'd regret within the month. "You'll be lucky to keep the car." I didn't argue. I simply closed my laptop, the one displaying a risk model I'd been refining for a 9-figure client portfolio that morning, and said, "Okay, Adrian," in the same even tone I used for every conversation with him for the past 6 months. He had no idea that the spreadsheet stuff he'd spent 8 years dismissing at dinner parties had brought my total compensation, base salary plus that year's performance bonus, to $950,000, or that his own divorce attorney was about to discover that fact in a discovery request neither of us had asked for. I remember the strange calm that settled over me in that exact moment, the sense that I was watching a man confidently walk toward a conclusion I already knew, with professional certainty, wasn't going to hold. My name is Simone Achebe. I was 39 years old, standing in the doorway of a marriage that was ending, when my soon-to-be ex-husband confidently predicted my financial ruin, without once, in 8 years of marriage, having actually asked what I did for a living beyond a vague, dismissive gesture toward the numbers thing. I remember thinking in that exact moment how strange it was that a man who had shared a bed with me for nearly a decade could be so completely, confidently wrong about something as basic as my own income, and how that confidence itself was the clearest evidence of exactly how little curiosity he'd ever actually extended toward my professional life. I work as a senior quantitative analyst at a mid-sized investment fund, building the risk models that inform decisions on portfolios worth considerably more than most people encounter in a lifetime. I started there as a junior analyst 8 years ago, the same year Adrian and I got engaged, making a modest but respectable salary that grew, steadily and substantially, with every promotion I earned over the following years. Junior analyst to analyst within 2 years, analyst to senior analyst within 4, and a series of increasingly significant bonuses tied to portfolio performance that, compounded over time, changed my financial reality considerably more than Adrian ever seemed to register. Adrian, meanwhile, worked in mid-level corporate sales for a regional distribution company, a stable, unremarkable job that paid reasonably well and that he discussed, at every dinner party we ever attended, with considerably more detail and pride than he ever afforded my own career. He'd worked his way up from an entry-level territory rep to regional accounts manager over roughly the same 8 years, a genuinely respectable trajectory in its own right, though one he narrated with a confidence that always seemed to require my own career, shrinking correspondingly smaller in the retelling. I remember the exact dinner party 4 years ago, when I mentioned briefly that I'd been promoted to senior analyst, and Adrian's business partner's wife asked what that meant in practice. Before I could answer, Adrian laughed and said, "She basically just stares at spreadsheets all day. Don't ask her to explain it. It'll put you to sleep," and the table moved on to a different topic before I'd said a single word about the promotion myself. I remember sitting there, wineglass in hand, feeling the particular, small humiliation of watching my own accomplishment get reduced to a joke before I'd even finished the sentence announcing it, and looking around the table to see whether anyone else had noticed. No one seemed to. Adrian moved smoothly into a story about a recent sales quota he'd hit, and the conversation carried on exactly the way it always did at those dinners, with his career occupying the center of the table, and mine dissolving quietly at the edges. I remember more clearly deciding that evening in the car home that I would simply stop bringing up my work in any detail at all, rather than fight for airtime at my own dinner table every single time. Adrian didn't notice the change, or if he did, he never once asked about it. That, in hindsight, might have been the more telling detail of the entire 8 years. Not that he dismissed my career when it came up, but that he never seemed to notice or care when I simply stopped mentioning it altogether. That decision, small and defensive as it felt in the moment, compounded quietly over 8 years into something neither of us fully registered until it mattered enormously. I stopped mentioning promotions. I stopped mentioning bonuses. I managed our joint household expenses efficiently enough that Adrian never had reason to look closely at where the comfortable cushion in our finances was actually coming from, and he never asked. The same incuriosity that let him dismiss my career at every dinner party, extending seamlessly into simply never wondering what any of it actually paid. I quietly funneled the bulk of my bonuses into a separate investment account I managed myself, the way any prudent financial professional would, telling myself it was simply good practice rather than a form of protection. I hadn't yet admitted I might need. I paid for larger household expenses without discussion. Let Adrian believe his own salary covered more of our lifestyle than it actually did, and never once corrected the quiet assumption that seemed to settle over our marriage, that whatever comfort we enjoyed came primarily from his side of the ledger. Looking back at the account statements from those years, the pattern is almost embarrassingly clear in hindsight. A woman quietly building an entirely separate financial identity while performing a much smaller one at every dinner table she sat at. Looking back, I think some part of me always understood, without articulating it clearly, even to myself, that a marriage where one partner's success has to be minimized to keep the peace isn't actually much of a partnership at all. I just didn't let myself examine that thought too closely for most of 8 years. The way you don't examine a lot of things you've quietly decided not to fight about. The affair, when I discovered it 8 months ago, wasn't even particularly well hidden. A coworker of Adrian's named Chloe, 29, who worked in the same regional sales office, texting him with a familiarity that stopped being deniable somewhere. Around the 4th time, I glimpsed his phone lighting up on the kitchen counter with a message that began, "Miss you already." I remember standing at the counter that evening, dish towel still in hand, staring at that message for a long moment before setting the phone back down exactly where I'd found it, giving myself the rest of the night to decide how I actually wanted to handle what I'd just seen. Rather than confronting him in the heat of the discovery itself, I confronted him calmly. 2 days later, the same composed tone I'd apparently perfected over years of being talked over at dinner parties, and he didn't deny it for long, offering instead a tired litany of complaints about our marriage, having grown apart, about feeling like I was always working, about a connection with Chloe that felt, in his words, easier. I remember finding that particular word almost darkly funny, easier, given that I'd spent years making myself smaller and quieter specifically to make things easier for him, and it apparently still hadn't been easy enough. I asked him, at one point during that conversation, whether he'd ever once actually asked me about my work in the past 2 years. Genuinely curious, rather than rhetorically pointed. He couldn't answer the question directly, which told me most of what I needed to know about how thoroughly he'd stopped seeing me as anyone worth asking questions of at all. We agreed that same week to begin divorce proceedings, both of us surprisingly civil about the logistics, even as the emotional reality of it took considerably longer to settle. I moved into a rented apartment within a month, taking only what genuinely felt like mine, letting Adrian keep the house we'd bought together 5 years earlier, a decision Anita gently questioned at our first meeting, but one I stood by, mostly because I simply didn't want to fight over a building that had stopped feeling like home to me, well before the affair ever came to light. Anita pointed out, more than once, that I was likely leaving money on the table by conceding the house so readily, and I told her, honestly, that I'd rather spend my energy on the parts of the settlement that actually mattered to me than on a building full of memories I was ready to let go of anyway. What struck me most in the months that followed wasn't the affair itself, painful as it was, but how quickly Adrian's contempt for my career escalated once he'd decided the marriage was ending. He began describing my job, in front of friends we were dividing along with everything else, as not exactly a real career, a phrase that landed with particular irony given he had never once asked what my actual title, responsibilities, or compensation were. He told our mutual friend Desmond, apparently, over drinks one evening, that he expected the divorce to go easily in his favor given that he'd always been the real earner in the relationship. A sentence Desmond later repeated back to me almost verbatim, laughing at how confidently wrong it turned out to be. Desmond told me he'd almost corrected Adrian on the spot, having a rough sense of my actual position from conversations we'd had years earlier at a mutual friend's wedding, but decided, in his words, it wasn't my place to ruin that particular surprise for him. The scene that began this story played out in what used to be our shared home office, 6 months into divorce proceedings, an argument about furniture division that had somehow escalated, the way most of our arguments did by then, into Adrian, reciting a version of our marriage where he had quietly carried the household while I disappeared into work he considered barely legitimate. The room still held half my disk's setup, a monitor. I hadn't yet moved to the apartment I'd rented 3 months earlier, and Adrian had taken to using the argument over who kept the desk as a proxy for a much larger argument about who had actually kept the marriage functioning all those years. "You'll never recover financially," he said, arms crossed in the doorway, delivering the line with the specific satisfaction of a man who believed he was landing a devastating final blow. "You'll be lucky to keep the car." His voice carried the particular confidence of someone who had spent 8 years assuming things about a topic. He'd never once asked a direct question about confidence built entirely on a joke he'd made at a dinner party years earlier and never once revisited. I didn't argue. I closed my laptop, the one displaying a risk model I'd been refining that morning for a client portfolio worth considerably more than either of us would discuss out loud in that argument, and said simply, "Okay, Adrian," the same even tone I'd used with him for the past 6 months of increasingly petty disputes. He had no real idea, standing there so confidently, that the mandatory financial discovery process our respective divorce attorneys were required to complete would, within a matter of weeks, hand his own lawyer. A document that would completely invert everything he currently believed about how this divorce was going to go. My own attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Anita Cole, had explained the process to me plainly at our first meeting months earlier. Both parties were legally required to disclose full financial records during divorce proceedings, my income included, and there was nothing to hide or strategize around, since the number would surface regardless of what Adrian assumed about it beforehand. "You don't need to do anything clever here," she told me, reviewing my documents with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. "The process itself is going to do more work than any strategy I could come up with." I asked her, half joking, whether she'd seen many cases where one spouse was this confidently mistaken about the other's finances. She smiled slightly, closing her folder. "More than you'd think," she said. "Usually it goes the other direction, though. This one's going to be memorable." I simply submitted my documentation the way the process required. My most recent pay stubs, my bonus statements, my retirement contributions, all of it entirely accurate, entirely unremarkable from my own perspective, the same paperwork I'd have submitted, whether Adrian had ever mentioned the words, "You'll never recover," or not. The first thing that happened was Adrian's own attorney, a methodical, soft-spoken man named Derek Voss, calling Adrian directly 2 weeks after the discovery documents were exchanged, asking him, according to what Adrian later admitted to Desmond, if he was aware of his wife's current compensation figures. Adrian, apparently, assumed it was some kind of clerical confusion, insisting there had to be an error, that Simone worked basically an entry-level analyst job. A description 8 years and 4 promotions out of date. Derek, according to Desmond's second-hand account, had to explain the figure to him twice, before Adrian would even accept that the number was accurate, rather than some administrative mistake in the paperwork, at one point apparently asking Derek to double-check whether the documents belonged to the correct case file entirely. The second thing happened when Adrian, unable to let it go, called Anita's office directly, against his own attorney's advice, demanding to see the documentation himself. Anita, entirely within her rights to decline, forwarded the request through Derek instead, maintaining the appropriate professional boundaries. Even as Adrian grew increasingly agitated on the phone with her assistant, apparently raising his voice enough that the assistant later mentioned it to Anita as slightly unusual for that kind of call. Adrian sat, according to Desmond, in stunned silence for a full minute after seeing the number $950,000 printed cleanly on a compensation summary with my name at the top. Staring at it, Desmond said, like it was written in a language he didn't recognize, before finally asking Derek, quietly, whether there was any way to have the figure independently re-verified. A request Derek gently declined to pursue given how thoroughly documented the number already was. The third thing happened at a family barbecue neither of us attended, but both of us heard about afterward. Chloe, apparently, had been quietly asking mutual acquaintances what Simone actually did for work, having absorbed Adrian's dismissive framing for months without ever independently verifying it, and someone finally mentioned, offhandedly, that I managed risk models for a fund managing several $billion in assets. Chloe reportedly went very quiet for the rest of the afternoon, according to the same acquaintance who later mentioned the exchange to Desmond, who seemed to take a certain amount of delight in relaying the entire chain of gossip back to me. Apparently, Chloe had spent the drive home that evening, asking Adrian pointed questions about his own financial situation for the first time since their relationship began. Questions he wasn't especially prepared to answer, honestly, given how much of his own confidence had rested on assumptions about my finances rather than any clear accounting of his. I met with Anita once more, 3 days before the mediation session, mostly to review the documents one final time and confirm there was nothing further I needed to prepare. There's really nothing strategic left to do here, she told me, closing her folder. The numbers speak for themselves. Your job at this point is just to sit there calmly while they do. I told her that sounded like the easiest instruction I'd been given in the entire process, and she laughed. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from her since we'd started working together months earlier. Most of my clients want to say something dramatic in that room, she said. The ones who just let the paperwork talk usually come out looking a great deal better in the end. I asked her, half seriously, whether she'd ever had a case quite like this one, where the surprise ran so entirely in one direction. She thought about it for a moment before answering. Once or twice, she said. It's always the same pattern. Someone stops asking questions they should have kept asking, and eventually the answer arrives anyway, just on someone else's timeline instead. The formal mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after that argument in the home office. Both attorneys present along with a neutral mediator in a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee, the kind of room I imagine has hosted hundreds of divorces exactly like ours, each one feeling entirely singular to the people sitting at the table. Adrian arrived looking noticeably less confident than he had at any point during the previous 6 months. A fact I registered without any particular satisfaction, mostly just quiet, professional attention to how the numbers were about to be laid out. He'd worn a suit, oddly formal for a mediation session, as though the occasion still called for some performance of authority he no longer had much claim to. Derek opened the financial portion of the session carefully, laying documents across the table in the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone, delivering news he already knew would land badly. Given the disclosed asset positions, he said, sliding a folder toward the center of the table. Equalization calculations under standard formula would require Mr. Achibi to make a payment to Mrs. Achibi rather than the reverse arrangement he'd previously anticipated. Adrian's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, then something closer to disbelief, then a flash of genuine anger that he visibly worked to suppress in front of the mediator. "That can't be right," he said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. "She's the one making all the money. I've carried this family financially for years." Anita answered before Derek could, her voice calm and precise. "Equalization isn't based on who earns more per year, Adrian. It's based on the marital assets each of you already holds as of the separation date. You kept the house, which had accumulated significant equity over 5 years and appreciated further while you occupied it. Simone's current income is high, but the bulk of what it's generated this year sits in an account, opened and funded well after our separation date, which places it outside the marital estate, entirely under the standard cutoff. Once you account for what's actually inside the marital estate as of that date, rather than simply who currently earns more, the number runs in her direction, not yours. Derek, to his credit, didn't argue the calculation, sliding the compensation summary across the table with the same careful neutrality he'd have used for any client. The math isn't optional here, Adrian. Her documented total compensation, including bonus, was $950,000 this year. But that figure is separate from what's driving this equalization number. The house equity you're holding is what puts you on the paying side of this calculation, regardless of her salary. Anita spoke for the first time since the session began, her voice calm, professional, entirely without malice. I want to be clear that Simone never concealed anything. She simply never volunteered information Adrian never asked for over 8 years of marriage. That's not deception. That's simply the natural result of one partner consistently dismissing the other's career without ever once inquiring about its actual details. The mediator, a neutral third party who had clearly seen every possible flavor of marital surprise over years of doing this work, made a small note on her legal pad and said nothing, letting the silence in the room do the rest of the explaining. Adrian turned to look at me directly for the first time since the session began, something almost pleading in his expression. "You could have told me," he said, quieter now. "I did tell you," I said, keeping my own voice even. "Every time I mentioned a promotion, a bonus, a new project, you just never once asked what any of it actually meant, and I stopped repeating myself to a room that wasn't listening." He didn't have an answer for that, and after a long moment looked back down at the documents in front of him, as though rereading the numbers might somehow change what they said. Derek, beside him, quietly closed his own folder and said gently but plainly, "Adrian, we need to revise your expectations for the rest of this session." The mediator, sensing the room needed a moment, suggested a short break before moving to the remaining logistical items, and Adrian stepped out into the hallway alone, his phone pressed to his ear, presumably calling Chloe or Desmond, or someone who could help him process what had just happened before he had to return to the table and finish the rest of the session. I sat quietly through all of it, hands folded on the table, watching Adrian absorb in real time the collapse of every assumption he'd built his entire post-marriage confidence around. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The numbers were doing something considerably more effective than anything I could have said myself. The session concluded shortly after, both attorneys agreeing to finalize the equalization terms in writing over the following weeks. Adrian left first, walking out to the parking garage without waiting for me, and I lingered in the conference room a moment longer with Anita, who packed her folder with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. "You handled that better than most people manage," she told me. "A lot of clients want to say something in that room. You just let it be true." I told her I hadn't trusted myself to say anything that wouldn't come out, sounding like exactly the kind of gloating I didn't actually feel, and she nodded, understanding completely. The equalization payment, once finalized, required Adrian to transfer a substantial sum to me, drawn primarily against the equity in the house he'd kept. A figure large enough that, according to Desmond, he ended up selling the boat he'd purchased 18 months earlier, as a symbol of the fresh start he'd been so confidently planning, simply to free up the cash the payment required. He'd bought that boat, Desmond mentioned once, almost immediately after our separation began, telling friends it represented finally living the life he deserved, a detail that felt considerably more poignant in hindsight than it probably had at the time. Once that same fresh start ended up funding a payment to the wife whose finances he'd so badly misjudged, Chloe. Once the actual financial picture became impossible to avoid, quietly distanced herself from the relationship within the month, telling a mutual friend she'd signed up for something different than a man, now facing a significant financial setback rather than the stable established partner Adrian had presented himself as throughout their entire relationship. I heard secondhand that she'd confronted him directly in front of Desmond at a going-away gathering. Neither of them realized would double as their breakup, asking flatly, "You told me she barely made anything. Why would you lie about something like that?" Adrian apparently didn't have a real answer, just a mumbled explanation about assuming it didn't matter. She reportedly told him, during that same final conversation, that she needed someone more stable right now, a phrase that struck Desmond, when he relayed it to me, as almost too on the nose to be believed, though he swore it was accurate. Adrian's own colleagues at the distribution company, several of whom had heard some version of his confident pre-divorce, boasting about coming out ahead, found the actual outcome difficult to resist mentioning, and Desmond told me, months later, that Adrian had grown noticeably quieter at the same industry events, where he'd once talked over my career so easily. One colleague, apparently, made a passing joke at a company function about spreadsheet money that landed considerably less well than intended, given the room's evolving understanding of exactly whose spreadsheets had turned out to matter more. Another colleague, a woman Adrian had worked alongside for years, reportedly told Desmond she'd always found Adrian's confidence about carrying his marriage slightly grating, and felt a certain quiet satisfaction watching the actual math finally catch up to the story he'd been telling for years. I didn't move for satisfaction's sake, though I won't pretend there wasn't some quiet vindication in watching 8 years of casual dismissal finally meet its actual math. Mostly, I felt something closer to grief for the version of our marriage where I'd simply stopped bringing up my own life, in any real detail, year after year, in order to keep a peace that turned out, in the end, to have cost me considerably more than it ever protected. I think about all those dinner parties now, all those moments. I let a joke about spreadsheets pass without correction, and wonder how differently the entire marriage might have unfolded if I'd simply insisted early on being taken seriously rather than accommodating a silence that eventually cost me 8 years of feeling smaller than I actually was. Desmond had been friends with both of us since college, close enough to Adrian that I'd half expected him to take sides once the divorce began. But he'd remained scrupulously neutral throughout, mostly serving as the accidental conduit through which each side of the story reached me secondhand. He called me the week after the mediation, laughing in the particular way close friends laugh when they're trying not to seem too delighted by someone else's comeuppance. "I have to tell you," he said. "Adrian called me the night after mediation, still in disbelief, asking if I'd known. I told him I had no idea what you actually made, same as him. I don't think he believed me. I told Desmond that made 2 of us who'd apparently underestimated exactly how thoroughly Adrian had never bothered to ask." Desmond admitted, a little sheepishly, that he'd wondered for years why I never talked about work much anymore, and had simply assumed I found it boring, rather than considering that I might have stopped bringing it up entirely. "I should have asked you directly," he said. "I think a lot of us just took our cue from how Adrian talked about it, without ever checking whether that version was actually accurate." I moved into a larger apartment downtown about 4 months after the mediation, closer to the office, with a home office space I decorated deliberately to feel entirely mine, no shared furniture negotiations required. I hung my actual diploma on the wall for the first time in 8 years, a small gesture that felt, oddly, like the most significant decoration choice I'd made in my adult life. Adrian had always found the diploma a bit much for a shared living room, and I'd stored it in a closet for most of our marriage rather than fight about it. It hangs directly across from my desk now, the first thing I see every morning before I open my laptop. I also framed the compensation summary from the mediation itself, not out of spite, but because it felt, in its own strange way, like the single most honest document anyone had produced about my career in 8 years. And I wanted it somewhere I'd actually see it. I started dating again cautiously, about a year after the divorce finalized, and found myself on an early date with a marketing director named Owen, almost bracing for the familiar dismissal when he asked what I did for work. Instead, he leaned forward, genuinely curious, and asked 3 specific follow-up questions about risk modeling that told me within minutes that he'd actually been listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk about himself. He asked, at one point, whether I found the work satisfying, a question so simple and so specific to me, rather than to some general idea of my career, that I actually had to pause before answering, unused to being asked something that direct. I remember feeling almost disoriented by how ordinary that should have been, and how remarkable it felt after 8 years of the alternative. We're still seeing each other, slowly, carefully, both of us aware of exactly how much rebuilding trust after a divorce actually requires, and he still asks good questions every time, without my needing to prompt him. I still work at the same fund, still build the same risk models Adrian once called spreadsheet stuff in front of an entire dinner table. I've started deliberately talking about my work again, in detail, without editing myself down to make anyone else more comfortable at the table. I gave a presentation to our fund's junior analysts last spring, walking them through a risk model I'd built for a particularly complicated portfolio, and found myself, mid-presentation, thinking about that dinner party 4 years earlier, the version of myself who'd gone quiet, rather than finish explaining her own promotion. One of the junior analysts, a sharp young woman named Priya, who reminded me faintly of myself at that age, asked an unusually perceptive question about a modeling assumption I'd made. And I remember feeling a small, genuine pride watching her take up space in that room without any of the hesitation I'd apparently trained myself into over years of a very different kind of room. I made a point after the presentation of telling her the question had been a good one, specifically by name, in front of the rest of the team, because I remembered exactly how much that kind of small, public acknowledgement would have meant to me at her stage. Priya thanked me afterward, mentioning that she sometimes felt hesitant to ask questions in larger meetings for fear of sounding uncertain, and I told her, honestly, that the willingness to ask a sharp question in front of a room was worth considerably more than the fear of momentarily sounding unsure. A lesson I'd learned considerably later in my career than I would have liked. I don't think I'll ever fully get back the years I spent making myself smaller, but I've decided that noticing the pattern at all and refusing to repeat it counts for something significant on its own. If you've ever quietly minimized your own success to keep the peace with someone who never bothered to ask about it honestly, I hope you remember this. The truth doesn't need your permission to eventually surface, and it rarely waits for a convenient moment to do it. Sometimes, it simply arrives through paperwork in a conference room, exactly when someone least expects it to. And sometimes the version of yourself, who stayed quiet for years, deserves more compassion than judgment, because she was managing something real, even if the way she managed it eventually needed to change. I think often about the specific mechanics of how invisible I'd made myself, professionally, inside my own marriage. Not through any grand deception, just 1,000 small omissions, 1,000 moments of letting a joke about spreadsheets pass without corrections, until the omissions themselves became the load-bearing structure of an entire 8-year dynamic. I don't think Adrian set out deliberately to build a marriage where my success had to stay invisible for his own comfort. I think it simply became easier for both of us, in different ways, and neither of us questioned closely enough why that ease came at a cost that turned out, in the end, to be entirely mine to carry. I've thought, too, about whether I would have handled things differently if I'd known, 4 years ago at that dinner party, exactly how the story would eventually end. I don't think I would have. I think the version of myself, who went quiet in that car ride home, was doing the best she could with the tools she had at the time, and I've stopped being angry at her for it, even as I've built something considerably more honest in the years since. Some nights, sitting in my new apartment with my diploma and my framed compensation summary, both visible from my desk, I think about how differently my 20s and early 30s might have felt if I'd simply insisted, from the very beginning, on being asked real questions about my own life, rather than accepting a marriage where my success had to stay quiet for someone else's comfort. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. Just with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who finally understands what she's willing to accept going forward and what she isn't. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has anyone ever underestimated you because they never bothered to actually ask what you did? Leave a comment below, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever gone quiet about your own success to keep someone else comfortable, I'd genuinely love to hear how that eventually played out for you too. We share stories like this one every day. Stories about quiet competence, overlooked success, and the moment someone finally stops shrinking themselves to make someone else comfortable. If you'd like to be part of that journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.